So, hi Rishi, thank you so much for joining us in the DaoLens Discord space. It is such a pleasure to host you. So excited to learn from your story, your journey, and get deeper into the mission of BioDAO and what you guys have been up to. So, thank you so much for hopping on. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I think, Rishi, the first question we'd love to ask you is how did you get introduced to the world of crypto? I feel like everyone has such a unique story on how they entered the space. So, would love to know, how did you start?
I would say I was in grad school. I wouldn't call myself like a very proficient programmer, but I mean, good enough to like do statistical models for grad school work. So that's where like I was kind of in touch with people who were a lot more tech savvy than I was. This was like back in 2013 or so when, the whole on-go thing happened and Bitcoin went from like 800 to like $40 or something.
Yeah.
And people were just talking around me. And so that's where that was my first kind of brush with this thing. It's like, oh, what is this? It's kind of interesting. And that's where it started. And then I just went down a rabbit hole from there.
That's insane. Did you ever investing at that point of time, like in Bitcoin and stuff? Because I feel like a lot of people got into this space because they could just see like exceptional like profits or exceptional margins there. Like, were you more interested in the tech per se?
Well, actually, so I did not invest that much at that point of time, not because of lack of want, rather lack of funding. So I wasn't really like putting money in there or anything, or even whatever I did, I just got out quickly. But more or less, it was just very interesting as a technology as to what it was doing. And I wasn't really that well versed in finance either at that point of time to really kind of fully grasp the impact of this technology. So more or less, it was just an interesting kind of, it seemed a little bit like Beanie Babies at that point of time that, okay, this seems like a fad. It's something interesting, but you can trade this and you can trade this quite readily as opposed to like a Beanie Baby. So it was like a very interesting asset at that point of time, right? And then people like, you see the Bitcoin pizza guy, like somebody bought a pizza with it.
Yes.
And so it just started getting interesting at that point of time. So it's very immature, still seemed like a toy. So at that point in time, it was still just a toy. And the very tech savvy people were like raving about it and working on it. I wasn't that technologically kind of capable at that point of time to really do anything with it. So I was just observing on the sidelines really at that point of time. And then over a period of time, as I gained more financial sense into how this works, that's when it started to truly click for me as to what this technology really is.
That's amazing. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people got introduced to Bitcoin during that time. Like everyone had at least heard about it, but some people got really interested in it who ended up even reading the white paper and stuff, versus some people just really thought it was a fad and, like we really can't say the way it played out. But on that note, I'd love to ask you, BioDAO, what would you say was the start, the journey, and what is the story behind it?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the start and journey, a bit of my background. So I have a PhD in molecular biology. And subsequently, after my PhD, I was a management consultant working primarily in the pharma sector and biotech sector. And so I had like a sort of front row seat on how these technologies are kind of, how these technologies mature basically, and there's a pretty long maturation curve on these technologies as well. And also got to see how they're funded and like what it really takes to get them out there. And at the same time, got to see what are the major pitfalls in the whole journey. And during this process, I realized that, okay, there's like at the very early stage of biotech, when the technology is quite immature, it's like about to it's more or less a discovery. It hasn't been really translated into a therapeutic yet. And that journey is actually very arduous. It's not easy. It takes a lot of skill. It takes money as well, funding as well. But more importantly, it takes a very concerted sort of combination of skill, money, people, right people at the right time to kind of do that. What I realized was that at that early stage, you can get the right advice from people. It can have an exponential impact on the success of the project. So to give you an example, if you were working on a RNA project and you had some senior scientist from Moderna come in and like comment on your project, I mean, that's invaluable. And that kind of talent is also very hard to come by. It's
Absolutely.
not readily available. At the same time, there's issues in the market where that kind of talent isn't really incentivized to do this either, because it's such a high risk field. I mean, give you an example. greater than 95% of discoveries actually do not translate into a therapeutic. I'm not saying that not all of them deserve to be translated into a therapeutic either, but even the ones that attempt to like try to go to the FDA route.
Could you expand more on what therapeutic means?
I would say therapeutic, I mean, as simple as that is just therapeutic is an intervention that would basically impact human health in some way, right? Let's put it very, very simply. But I mean, anything can impact human health, right? So you're not going to call exercise a therapeutic. It's a preventive move. What I would call therapeutic is a real intervention in terms of a small molecule, which is something you ingest, or an injection, which is an injectable, or cell and gene therapy, which is more or less something what we have been having as vaccines nowadays in the mRNA vaccines, right? So those would all be called therapeutics of some sort, right? You can extend this further to devices as well, right? So there's like devices like ultrasound devices that are therapeutic in some ways, and there's like transcranial electroinduction that's also done, which can also be therapeutic. But those are further, I would put them more in devices, not as like pure therapeutics, right?
Absolutely. Got it. No, I didn't mean to interrupt all your story, but I felt like a lot of our audience could be like, not that native to, the DSci and the biotech space. I felt like that term was something that we come across often, which thank you for expanding on it.
Yeah. And so, I felt that there's a lot of gaps in the system that can be filled out. And there's no real solution to do it. And it required like a new incentive mechanism for people to participate. At the same time, it required a collaborative effort. So you kind of needed, it almost felt like you need to engage the hive mind of available talent out there, which is kind of quite siloed across large companies right now. Probably like the GSKs and Pfizers of the world have thousands of scientists, but they are kind of isolated and siloed. Yes. And at the early stage, really, there is not much conflict because it's such an early stage discovery. There's really no conflict for anybody to actually participate in it. That is kind of the genesis of BioDAO, right? Another kind of main push or impetus towards BioDAO was that when you look at technologies across the world, you kind of see these biotech hubs across the world, like you see San Diego, Boston, some in Cambridge, London, some in Europe as well. And that's not the only place where biotech research is happening, obviously. It's happening in all these flyover states in the US and various other corners of the world. And the idea was, how do we basically, these people don't have the right network. They may have the right technologies, but they don't have the right network or the resources to really develop or even realize the potential of these discoveries that they may have at hand.
Yeah.
And the motivation was, how do you actually create a platform where they can easily come to you and kind of say, hey, I have this, can somebody help me with this technology, or I want to push this forward? What are the best ways to do it? And so there is another motivation to basically go after the long tail of discoveries as opposed to these concentrated places that exist.
That's amazing. I think the more I'm learning about DSci, I didn't quite understand exactly what it was capable of. But now that I learned, there's so many scientists, like you said, are working in an isolated manner. But through DAOs and through this whole decentralized thing, you're able to create this network effect where you're able to connect scientists with their research and stuff. So I think that's incredible what you're doing. I'd love to ask you, why do you choose to work around DAOs? And do you think that DAOs is like one of the most impactful ways to accelerate the mission that BioDAO has?
Yeah, so I think the way I look at DAOs, right, in general, the way DAOs are structured is they're kind of a cooperative. Essentially, they're structured as a cooperative, right? And in the very early stages of research, right, or at least for BioDAO, why it's so applicable for biotech, right, is we needed this expertise to come in at an early stage. But at the same time, we needed to de-risk it as well. So what typically happens is, for a very senior scientist who's like, let's say, even consulting on a project, right? The startup can often not like afford a very senior scientist to come in and consult. And at the same time, so they'll do it for equity, or they'll do it for something like, a return, like sort of pay them in future or something like that. And 9 out of 10 go bust, right? Yeah. So, we were trying to say, okay, how can we create an incentive mechanism in the DAO space, right? Or so incentive mechanism for all of these people to participate, at the same time de-risk themselves. And DAOs presented a very good alternative mechanism to do the same. And so that's where I see the kind of power of DAOs, where they're this cooperative, but they have a very clear incentive alignment tool via call it cryptocurrencies or NFTs or whatever tokenization aspect that you're using.
Right. This conversation we were recently having, like what DAOs today are struggling with is to retain talent, because at the end of the day, people are, like making it their full-time gig, because at the end of the day, people, want to pay their bills, put a roof over their head. But do you think a DAO, if it's necessary for a DAO to have like a certain level of treasury, only that's when they can actually get like real talent? Because you talk about incentivizing these people, but how would you incentivize them if you're relatively like, you're just starting out tomorrow?
I know, great question. So I think in terms of talent incentivization, right, a lot of so depends on what incentives people need, right? So when through our several interviews that we've done with our experts, they just want to participate because they want to be a part of the movement, and they're just so excited about like this alternative route towards looking at discoveries, right? Incentive so it doesn't always have to be financial. That's what I'm trying to say. For us, I mean, for some of the people that we work with, for them the incentive is to actually be able to see discoveries that are happening in different corners of the world, right? Which is not accessible readily to them.
Yeah.
So there's different incentives, and I think each DAO has to figure it out themselves, right, as to what incentive is going to click with their audience. Now, I mean, of course, if you ask me if a community manager needs to be, their incentive is pretty different. It's not biotech related. Their incentive is going to be probably more monetary. And I understand that. But for us, the core audience that matters to us are the founders of these biotechs, the experts that come in. For a lot of the founders that we spoke with, right, for them, having a community of founders itself was a large enough incentive. Mm-hmm. Hey, I have this community that is like bound by this DAO. This is fantastic. I've never had this. A lot of the biotech founders right now that we spoke with, and they were struggling to find resources. They were looking at Clubhouse as a resource. Right, like going to talks over there, and we thought that this is a much better alternative. So that's so I would basically summarize that by saying incentives are not always. I think there's a bias towards going monetary on that. Right. That's not really true.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's an incredibly interesting perspective. What would you say has been your biggest learning around the DAO ecosystem today? It's still a space which is so ambiguous. It's still a place where people don't really trust its future. You see people being DAOs and then eventually wanting to turn into like a centralized org. But how is it that you see it today?
Yeah, great. I think that's a great point. So DAOs, as of now, in my frank opinion, they're quite ephemeral in nature. In the sense that it's a flash in the pan. There's a lot of hype around something. People come together. But that's not what it takes to really build an organization. Mm-hmm. And I'm more or less a proponent of progressive decentralization as opposed to progressive centralization of a decentralized org. So because the latter is more or less like picking up the pieces of a pretty distributed skeleton and like sort of trying to patch together an organization, as opposed to having an org starting out strong with a centralized. It doesn't have to be centralized, but at least, let's say, a core team that is fully responsible for it, right?
Absolutely.
And then gradually decentralizing parts that make sense to be decentralized. And then there's certain parts that actually there's no benefit for them to be decentralized, really, right? So I can like point out several aspects of DAOs that when I see like, okay, what's the point of decentralizing like, onboarding or something like that. Like, just use centralized services to actually just onboard people. It's what you are doing, right? So I think those kind of points, this is where I think sometimes DAOs kind of run away with the decentralization narrative a little too far. I'm a proponent of sort of start strong, start centralized, decentralize the parts that are that can be decentralized or need to be decentralized, give appropriate rights. So I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of people, forward thinkers in the crypto community have commented on that too, is that there's this, we see DAOs kind of vote on everything, but should everybody be voting really? So that's a problem that we face a lot, and which is, should everybody be voting on what biotech projects to be supported or not? This just doesn't make sense, right? It's there's a reason why we have some like centralized orgs like FDA and all to make decisions on these things.
Absolutely.
So we want to be very responsible with that. And so, but then there's certain governance aspects where it completely makes sense to be fully democratic and have vote from everybody, right? So I think those things are better figured out gradually as the org forms around it, as opposed to forming an entire org and having all these decisions being like sort of whirling around in a in sort of a disorganized manner, and then figuring out and then progressively centralizing them. So that's my sort of take on it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Just piggybacking off of that answer, what would you say are some of your current biggest pain points that you're facing as a DAO? What's one thing that you're trying to get done? What is one job that you're trying to get done internally?
So I think internally, I would say one thing that I'm trying to realize is or at least, I mean, the approach we took was instead of D-work, right, which is where you post a job and what happens, at least what we observed was a lot of jobs posted on D-work, people don't pick them up. Sometimes they do pick it up, but it's like not done properly, and then you have to redo the whole thing anyway. And I think one of the biggest pain points, at least I see, is how do you assign proper project leads, right? Like how do you assign like a proper project lead to say, hey, this is what you're responsible for. Now you need to execute against this, right? That's one. And then the other bigger pain point that I see is actually onboarding people into Web3, which may or may not be the right thing to do, right? So there's a lot of other, like, for example, I would cite Flow, for example, or what Dapper Labs has done, right? You don't even know you're interacting with crypto when you're buying a pack on their site, right? So they've done this very fantastically, where they've kind of really just these rails for people to be onboarded from the Web2 world. And even when we look at our DAO, right, I would say like 99% of our talent pool is actually in Web2, not in Web3, right? And it's really hard to get some 50, 60-year-old scientists to get them to open MetaMask, right? So is that the challenge we want to fight? No, that's not like the battle I want to fight, really, right? That'll happen gradually. I think that's one of the bigger ones. And how do I onboard people who are not necessarily in Web3, who still some of them think, oh, Bitcoin's eating up too much energy, that's why I don't want to use it. It's not friendly for the environment. Wrong narrative, I'm not going to argue that, but they have different notions about it. And so how do I onboard them effectively into this DAO ecosystem?
Absolutely. Just on that note, if you were to develop a product today, what product do you think can help you do it faster and better to the mission, to the end goal, to the ambition that you guys have?
So I think a product in this line, in terms of specifically the onboarding piece, I would basically have a platform that really makes the whole opening up a MetaMask or any custodianship or any of these things really in the background, right? I often compare this to like what email was like 30, 40 years ago, where you had to have like a sender and you had to have like all these scripts written out, and then you had the body of the email, and then you'd send it out. Mail comes across and they're like, oh, it's all in the background. All you got to do is just send the text, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're headed to. We're not going to be bothering with this OX968, whatever address somebody has. It's all going to go in the background at some point of time.
Yeah.
And you're just going to be interacting with people, which is where the main crux of the solution is. It's actually people interacting with each other, not cryptocurrencies interacting with each other.
Interesting. Isn't that something that sounds very similar to what ENS domains were doing, right? Instead of you interacting with these long string of like, MetaMask, like, just any basically crypto wallets and stuff, you're interacting with these, like Rushi.eth. No one knows that it has like a 10-digit number with like digits and stuff attached to it. Interesting. Do you have an ENS domain yourself? Is that something that you dived into?
I do. I have rushitrivedi.eth. I do have that. The point being that, again, still the burden remains as you still have to onboard people onto an ENS domain. So you still have to go through MetaMask, do all of that, and then it goes in the background, right? So I think it's going to evolve over a period of time. I feel confident it is going to. I mean, just seeing where DeFi is going now, where it has become so much more sophisticated than what it was 2 or 3 years ago. I think that's the same thing is going to happen to DAOs and other spaces of crypto as well.
Interesting. What makes you passionate about Web3? I'd love to know.
I think so. One thing that has really caught my attention is decentralized finance. It's just mind-boggling what you can do with decentralized finance. It's opened up a whole new kind of way of doing things. And so to me, that is one thing that like I struggle to keep up with because it's moves so fast. It's insane how the amount of innovation that's happening in that space. But it's just presented a whole new way of doing things. And especially what keeps me going is, or learning more and more about that aspect is not the parts where DeFi is kind of replicating what's done in TradFi, DeFi is kind of doing brand new things that could not be done in TradFi. It's bringing in completely new imperatives to life. For example, it's doing like perpetuals, right? Which used to exist, but like were hardly applicable in TradFi. But then in DeFi, they've just taken it by storm in a kind of a new packaged way that it's being brought forward by BitMEX and DYDX. So those kind of I'm absolutely fascinated by that by DeFi.
That's awesome. And I know, like, Web3 is such an intense space, right? Like when you're in Web3, I know you're running BioDAO, it's something that takes away all your time. But apart from crypto, what would you say are some of your passions? I know you shared like mountain biking was one of them, but what else would you say?
Yeah, other than that, I enjoy cooking a lot, so I cook by
Cool.
myself a lot. I really enjoy that. And then, I mean, it's going to be winter soon, so I'm ready to hit the slopes and start skiing.
That's amazing. Okay, hopping back on to DAOs. What would you say are currently one of the biggest advantages slash disadvantages working in the DAO space?
Yeah, I think advantages, I think we've kind of elaborated them a little earlier, but it's more or less kind of really tapping into the hive mind of groups of people, right? Like how can I tap into this hive mind and basically do something that a centralized group or a centralized thinking manner of thinking would not be able to achieve, right? I think that's one. And another one is the biggest advantage that DAOs have is incentive alignment. So it's almost hard, like unless you have like a very weird kind of a token drop, you're not going to have misaligned incentives, right? So it really incentivizes people to work towards the betterment of the organization that they're a part of. I think that those things are very, those are very kind of attractive things about DAOs. And you can call it a DAO, you can call it a cooperative. I think nowadays people call it like, it's just the, when I look at pitch decks, I see like the nomenclature change slightly every now and then.
Yeah.
People call it a cooperative, people call it a DAO. That's fine. There might be legal implications on how you structure it. That's why they're probably calling it that. But I think it just aligns incentives, which is fantastic. In terms of disadvantages, so DAOs are kind of also suffer from the whole tragedy of commons policy, right? Like where they kind of have this, you have this group of individuals, but it's not always, might is not always right. It's kind of neither is majority. And that is especially applicable for startups, right? Like you have to kind of have a strong decision-making process, first of all, which I don't think most DAOs have figured out. And secondly, you have to have a strong sense of ownership on certain deliverables, which is also, I think some DAOs have sort of started to figure that out. The DAOs that have actually done it the best, I've noticed, are kind of very DeFi aligned. So again, there, like the financial incentive is very clearly there.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. You make a poor decision, you're going to get penalized for it, so you better make a good decision.
Yes.
And I think for DAOs that have a longer tail, like BioDAO, which has a much longer, sort of a return for any kind of a work that you do on it, that's a much bigger challenge because you have to keep, and again, as you mentioned, people's attention spans in this industry are, I think, run in weeks rather than months or even years.
Yes.
So that's a big disconnect.
Right. Also, community, this is a great opportunity to ask your questions one-on-one with Rishi live. So please drop your questions in the chat. We have a bunch of questions that we're bouncing off of, and then we will hop directly onto the community questions. But Rishi, coming back to you, what would you say has been your perspective on people's negative attitude towards like crypto in general, calling it a fad? Like, how is it that you respond to it? I'm sure like a bunch of folks, like you said, who are still not like familiarized with the Web3 system, the DAO system, they've only seen like NFTs and crypto and, all the headlines of, like just fake profit and stuff. Like, how is it that you deal with the negative attitude?
So first of all, they're not wrong either, right? So the criticism that you get, like a lot of, it's easy. I don't want to come across as a crypto maxi or a naysayer, but you have to kind of take a neutral approach to it. And I'm not in the camp that says, oh, crypto is going to replace everything in the world. I'm definitely not in that camp. I would say that there's a traditional finance system, and best what crypto does is offers you a parallel financial system. So it'll exist and it'll be in parallel. There's no need for it to actually compete with traditional finance, really. It just doesn't need to. just the way DAOs don't need to compete with centralized orgs. They can just be. I mean, we've had cooperatives exist for centuries now, and they're existing. So they're just carving their own space out, right? And that's number one. In terms of people who say, well, is it a fad? Yeah, there are large parts of crypto which are just a fad, right? I mean, we just have to be honest about it. With all the new sort of, I mean, you look at every industry and how like the ICO boom occurred, and then we had all these tokens come out, ERC20 tokens come out, which were like essentially useless.
Yes.
Now you have NFTs that came out, and you have some top 4 or 5 of them, and now we just have the same useless ERC20 tokens, but with a picture on top of it. It's just essentially how I define like the newer NFTs that are coming out. At the same time, you start to see like as the crypto bear market kind of washed out a lot of the bad coins, it's doing the same thing in the NFT space as well, where a lot of the not sincere projects are being washed out. More sincere projects are being sort of getting adoption, right? They're thinking more cleverly and more intensely about, okay, how do we really sort of make a change through NFTs, and how can we really utilize them in a different way, right? So, and you're seeing that with like projects like Artifact, which was doing like these 3D animations and got bought out by Nike recently. So there's like different angles, but yeah, there is. I mean, and also I'll draw another parallel is with any new technology, right? Like
absolutely,
any new technology, you see 90% of the kind of projects are going to get washed out because they couldn't figure it out, and then there's 10% that are going to grow and keep building that industry, and then you have that 10% compound over a period of time, and it'll eventually become a whole industry. But I definitely do not agree with the whole narrative that it's going to compete with traditional finance or traditional ecosystems. It doesn't need to. It can be on its own.
This is a really interesting perspective. Do you believe in NFTs? Do you hold some yourself?
I absolutely do. So I do hold some NFTs. I'm particularly not a person who's that much into collecting them for art per se. I understand that there is an art element to it. I totally see that. But I'm more interested in applications of NFTs in a sense where it's actually trying to bring either A, communities together towards a cause, or B, it is actually utilizing the NFT token or NFT, the technology itself, in a more financial sense. So, for example, the way like Uniswap has its like E3 positions as an NFT. Now, to me, that's like a very interesting utility of a ERC721 token.
Right. Absolutely. Any favorite projects that you have your eyes on?
Favorite projects right now that I have my eye on in the decentralized finance world, I would say I'm probably very much I'm following a couple of projects that I'm like just very intrigued by. Like there's Ribbon Finance, which is like doing a very interesting on options in this industry, which I find super interesting. And then in the NFT space, there's like another project coming out, NFT Perps. So they're doing perpetuals using NFTs, which we'll see where it leads to over a period of time. But so those are the two projects that I kind of am interested. I'm just observing as to see what happens there. And then in terms of the DAO or the DeSci world, right? I'm following all of them. Like I really like what Vita DAO has done in that space, and I kind of follow them, and they've kind of really done a great job kind of building a DAO out, right? So it's kind of really nice to see them grow. And then there's a couple of other interesting projects that are happening in more on the healthcare side of DeSci as well, in terms of patient data and doing decentralized trials. So those are very interesting to me too as well.
We just hosted Lawrence from DAO just like next week, and I was talking to him. I was like, how is it that you guys partnered up with Pfizer? How did that happen? And he said, a bunch of folks just had hopped in their Discord server. So why do you think a company like Pfizer got so interested? DAO is specifically working towards longevity, but what would be your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I mean, we're also working with Pfizer, so they're very much interested in kind of getting in this space, right? Which is great to see that a very mature company like Pfizer sees the potential of this kind of a movement, right? I think primarily their interest is more or less in terms of just getting in early technologies, right? Like to be able to have a front row seat on early stage technologies.
Interesting. We have a bunch of community questions. I would love for you to take them up. Can you see the chat? We have a question from Praful, would you like to read that one out?
Yeah, Praful, how and when does therapeutic treatment come under Purdue Medical Association compliances? So I think what you mean is an FDA compliance here. And in terms of a therapeutic, so you really, I mean, nothing becomes a treatment until it goes through the FDA. So I would not go that far. Say any kind of a technology that is in the let's say on the bench right now, still at the university bench or at the research scientist bench. The first step for it to basically become formalized and say, hey, I am trying to become a therapeutic, is when they apply for something called an IND, which is an investigational new drug application, INDA. And investigational new drug application is basically, you actually can even file a pre-IND. So now FDA is just trying to make things easier for people. So you can even file a pre-IND and have a meeting with the FDA. And that's where you basically say, hey, I have this technology or this kind of intervention, and it can be used in this disease model. It does these changes. I have the data behind it, and I would love to really put this to test and start doing clinical trials on this. So that's called the pre-IND, and you do that, and there's a back and forth with the FDA, so to speak, on this, where they look at it, say, okay, this makes sense, approved, and if it's approved, it goes further. That's when you start doing what is typically called clinical trials or so you typically go to an IND with preclinical studies. Preclinical studies will be stuff that you've done in mice, for example, or some sort of an animal model. Then you take it to, once the FDA gives you a green signal, you start your phase 1 clinical trial. And that's around phase 1A or B, depending on how you actually structure the clinical trials. You will basically have this moment which is called the first in human. The first in human is a big moment for any drug, right? Like the first time you're allowed to actually test your drug in a human being. You're still not testing for efficacy, actually. In the beginning, you're only testing for safety. But you will, the data will come back to you and you will have some read on efficacy. That's the big moment. So that's where it starts. To answer your question, that's where it begins. And from there on, you just go through phase 1, phase 2A, phase 2B, 3, and then you finally go to approval.
Thank you so much for answering that. We have a question from Priya.
Hold on, there's one more question on that, which was HIPAA compliances, right? And does it apply to a DAO? So if at any point of time you are interfacing with patient data, doesn't matter what kind of data it is, any kind of patient data, right? It could be blood work, it could be their blood pressure, doesn't matter what it is. That's where HIPAA compliance comes into play, right? So that's a completely different play on the whole. If you're looking at it from biotechnology, that's not biotech really, that's health tech. And the HIPAA compliance comes into play when you're working with patient data, especially if it is the main concern is basically anonymity, right? Like you need to randomize the patient data. You can't have identifiable patient data, or that basically breaks the HIPAA compliance laws.
Thank you for answering that, Rishi. Yes, the question from Priya, I'll read it out alternatively, is how do you deal with people who come only for the tokens, who might not be interested in voting or may not know enough to vote?
So how do we deal with people? So we actually don't do the token sale. So we're not going to do a sale at all. We're actually just going to have a drop, and that drop is going to be based on our proof of work. So you have to have done some work for the DAO. You have to clearly show us credibility that you are actually in this for the biotech, right? You have the credentials for it, and there'll be different kind of votes as well. And only then you have access to this token. Other than that, we're perfectly happy being a small community. We do not need to become a 50, 60,000 people DAO, really.
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very important point for communities. How successful a community is now really redefined in the Web3 world. It's not about the number of people, but it's about, the quality of people who are really engaged and who are really in it for the mission. We have a question from Aurora Brolis. I would love for you to take it up.
So do I see more traditional companies like Pfizer going down on the research side via the DAO route? In your opinion, is that a niche, and can it be useful for research across industries? So if I understand the question correctly, what you're trying to ask is, would Pfizer basically utilize a DAO to do clinical research I would view that with skepticism, because clinical research is not that trivial to do. There's a lot of compliance already needs to be in place. So, for example, what's the end goal here, right? After any of this research, the end goal is if it is to submit for a drug application. There's a lot of FDA regulation on that already, that needs to be done in certain compliant labs. It needs to be done in certain ways, all of that. And so I would be surprised if that happens, A. B can it be for very early stage work, right? Like job work. Essentially, like, hey, I will have this experiment that needs to be validated. Can somebody do it for me? Potentially, yeah. Potentially. It can be utilized. I would want to see, but where would the DAO be doing this work, right? So where would the DAO be? Like, will they have their own lab? Is that just a service? Is that a CRO, right? Is that a clinical research organization or a contract research organization that they're contracting it out to? So is the DAO serving as a contract research organization? That's what I would like to sort of put first if I was doing that. Like, if I'm trying to put myself in like a pharmaco's shoes, because they have tons of resources, right? They have no shortage of bench space or money to do this. When it boils down to certain very specialized expertise, let's say, maybe I do see an angle for it, maybe in some sort of like statistical analysis of like genomics, right? I think those things, those are probably going to get commoditized sooner or later anyway. And if DAOs can but there's a dearth of talent like that can actually effectively do it. So maybe sort of any kind of programming or any kind of such skills that are not readily available. That could be an angle, and I think LabDAO is kind of taking that angle as well. So there are certain areas where it may be applicable, but not for others. And then is that a niche that can be useful for research across industries? I really can't comment on like industries, like if it's just chemistry or if it's like researching solar cells or something like that. I think what you're trying to ask in this question is any deep tech, right? Like this is all deep tech that we're looking at, biotech, climate change, all of these like kind of climate technologies, they are very deep tech. There's quite a very high upfront investment to validate some technology, which can then potentially become a commercializable technology. Do DAOs offer, my question to you then back is, do DAOs offer a more economical route to do this? And is there a reason why DAOs would be able to do it more economically than what traditional centralized orgs are able to do it? I currently do not see that. I just don't see the gap in the system where it could really plug themselves right now. But I might be wrong, and I'd love to be proven wrong, actually.
Thank you so much, Rishi, for taking up the community questions. And thank you so much, guys, for asking your questions in the chat. Rishi, I'd love to ask you, personally, what would you say is something that really drives you, apart from crypto, apart from BioDAO? Like, what gets you up in the morning?
Gets me up in the morning, apart from crypto, BioDAO is, just the ability to kind of do something in this new. It is a new space, so that's where I'm working. So I can't like devoid myself off of it. But just the ability to like really make an impactful change in this entire sector, right? And the other thing I'd say, just bringing sort of, I was more of a traditionalist, and I kind of stayed at the sort of almost at the precipice of this industry for a long time before jumping in. So I was like, I watched the Ethereum kind of ICO, and then I watched the ICO boom happen in like 2017, and then I like just waited on the sidelines for the longest time.
Yeah.
And during that time, I was just building experience in the traditional world, and then finally thought, okay, this is like really worth jumping into, not just because of the growth aspect of it, right? It's not just the growth aspect that it's a fast growing industry, but more or less it's from the perspective of there's just so much talent that is waiting on the sidelines to come into this industry, and that can be ready onboarded. And secondly, the velocity of this industry is so high because they've made. They're basically, at the end of the day, I always view all of these technologies, Ethereum, Bitcoin, whatever, they're all fintech essentially, and they've just made the velocity of money so much faster. It's bound to attract just more and more interesting people to come into it. So that's one thing, and then just interacting with very, very interesting people in this industry day in and day out. So, for example, like I've been interacting recently with like one of the world champion kite surfers to kind of see, hey, is there something we can do with NFTs here? And it's just, I would have never ended up talking to this person, right? I would have never ended up like even interacting with this person. But it's just bringing a whole bunch of very interesting characters into this industry.
Yeah, it's amazing how people all over the world have like just gathered on, with Web3, brings people together. It's incredible. And I think one of the last questions I'd love to ask you is if you had one message, that you would like to share with people is why should they care about Web3 or why is it worth being in the Web3 space? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Why is it worth being in the, why should they care about Web3? I think Web3 is doing something very interesting in terms of it's not challenging the existing financial systems, but it's it's a new form of almost a fresh kind of efficiency to these systems. So, I mean, any kind of financial rails are now kind of just getting simplified more and more with Web3. And to me, that is very, very interesting, right? And why should you care about it? Because the way I look at it is, I look at it right now, right? What Web3 is doing is it is very effectively tokenizing aspects of life. When I look at DeSci as well, I mean, what's happening in DeSci is science is getting tokenized. That's exactly what's happening. If you look at what Beta DAO is doing, if you look at what BioDAO is trying to do, even some other ones like Scinet is doing, right? We're trying to all tokenize different aspects of science. Some are going after the papers. Some are going after longevity. Some are going after, like us, who are going after talent itself, right? And you take a further, bigger picture view on this. Basically, we're going through this phase of tokenization of assets, of all things, right? So, I mean, blockchain or Ethereum in the beginning started to tokenize this early stage angel funding aspect. Essentially, that's what I think of the ICO Go, right? That it's kind of tokenized that entire aspect, and it made it so easy for anybody to own like a share in a company essentially through their ERC20 token. Didn't translate very well eventually, but not for most. But the success rate is kind of similar to angel investing.
Absolutely.
9 out of 10 went bust, but one of them was a big success, right?
Yeah.
And similarly, you're seeing now with NFTs how this very interesting aspect of our life got tokenized. Nobody thought art would get tokenized, but now art is getting tokenized, right? So it's a very interesting phenomena that's happening, that art is getting tokenized, and now you're seeing lending on art being tokenized, right? Like people are able to lend art all of a sudden. Most people didn't have access to these tools at all. People are doing these various interesting experiments with real estate and with all these different kinds of assets that they want to tokenize on there. So it's just interesting to see like why they should be in Web3, because you know how people. This is like I hope I don't end up putting my foot in my mouth here, but just the way 10 years ago people were saying, sooner or later your industry is going to get digitized. Like 10 years or 12 years ago, people were saying that your digital is coming for you. Every industry is going to get digitized. I think we might be 10 years from now, we'll be saying the same thing about tokenization, that sooner or later, whatever community is there or whatever asset class is available to a particular community is going to get tokenized. And more importantly, what this tokenization is allowing us to do is it's allowing us to tokenize very abstract concepts like art or like communities, right? Like how do I take a powerful community and then now tokenize it, right? I don't think we have a full answer to it, but we have the tools for it already. So some clever group is going to come across and like start to figure it out, and but right now we have the tools for it, and it's going to happen. At least I'm a believer. It's going to get tokenized sequentially over a period of time.
Incredible. Rishi, this was just like an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your invaluable insight. It was such a pleasure to host you. Any ending thoughts?
No, thank you so much for all the amazing work you're doing at DaoLens. I think we would not have been successful in our onboarding programs without you. I absolutely love what DaoLens is doing, and I think in parting thoughts, I think what we've shared a lot together is where is the industry headed, and how do you onboard more people in there by sort of making crypto not as daunting, or not any of these onboarding rails not as daunting. I think you're doing some fantastic work on that, and I think we're also doing some work on that in terms of bringing people on board in a way that they don't even know that they're interacting with crypto or any kind of these rails, and they're doing what they're best at, which is doing biotech. They don't need to become better at doing crypto. to be participating in our DAO. And so that's our goal as well. So that's my parting thought. So thank you so much for being such a service to the DAO community.
Thank you, Rishi. It was such a pleasure. So grateful for you to be such an early partner. And thank you so much, community, for logging in, tuning in. Please stay tuned for the next week episode and who our guest is going to be. Have a lovely rest of the week. And Rishi, thank you for being incredible. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.